It was a cold, crisp morning when I set out on the hike. I had been planning this solo trip for weeks. Just me, a backpack, and the wide-open wilderness. The kind of hike that was supposed to clear my head, let me breathe in the mountain air, and maybe take a break from the noise of everyday life. A break I was starting to think I needed more than I realized. The trail I picked was relatively unknown to most people, which is exactly what I wanted. It was marked on a map as a moderate hike, which in my experience was a polite way of saying it would challenge me without being overly dangerous. I wasn't an expert hiker, but I had done my fair share of hiking and camping. I knew what I was doing, or at least I thought I did. I had all the gear I needed: water, food, extra layers, a first aid kit, a compass, and even a flashlight. The weather was supposed to stay clear all day, which was good, but a part of me felt like I was missing something. I tried to brush it off. As I started up the trail, the early morning mist still clung to the trees, making the forest feel oddly quiet. It was strange. Normally, by this time, birds would be chirping, small animals would be moving through the underbrush, but it was silent. So silent. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional rustle of the wind through the leaves. I pushed forward, shaking off the uncomfortable feeling that came with the silence. The air was fresh, the kind of air you could taste in your lungs. It felt good, and I focused on putting one foot in front of the other, allowing my mind to wander. I thought about work, about the relationships I had been neglecting, about the world outside this place. All of those things felt so distant now, and for the first time in a long while, I was truly alone with my thoughts. I could have stayed in that moment forever. The path soon began to narrow, winding deeper into the woods. The trees were older here, taller, and their trunks had thick moss growing on them. The air smelled earthy, rich with the scent of pine and damp soil. As I walked, I noticed that the sun, though bright, seemed to struggle to break through the thick canopy above. I paused at a small stream to refill my water bottle, dipping it into the cool, clear water and watching the gentle current flow over rocks. Everything felt peaceful until it didn't. It was hard to pinpoint the moment when things started to feel off. Maybe it was when I noticed the first faint scratch marks on the trees. They were just small gouges, nothing alarming, but they seemed fresh, like something had clawed its way through them recently. I dismissed it as the work of an animal, maybe a bear, though it struck me as odd that I hadn't seen any sign of wildlife up until now. No tracks, no droppings, just nothing. I continued on, trying to convince myself that it was just a minor detail, something easily overlooked. But the deeper I went, the more I began to feel the isolation. It wasn't just the quiet. It was the way the woods seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing longer despite the early hour. The trail twisted, and before I knew it, I had lost track of time. My map was in my pocket, but I hadn't felt the need to check it yet. The trail had been pretty straightforward at first, but now it was getting harder to discern. I glanced at the compass, but the needle seemed to jump slightly every time I looked at it. I shook my head, thinking it was a glitch. I had read somewhere that electronics and compass needles sometimes reacted oddly in the mountains, but I still couldn't shake the unease settling in my chest. After a few more turns, I came to a clearing, a wide space where the sun finally broke through. The view was breathtaking, mountains looming in the distance, and the valley stretching out below me. But there was something wrong about this place. The grass was uneven, trampled, as if something large had been here recently, moving back and forth. And the air was different here, thicker, heavier. I couldn't explain it, but I had this overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. That's when I heard it, the faintest sound of footsteps behind me. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then it came again, the unmistakable crunch of leaves and twigs breaking. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. My first instinct was to turn around, to call out, but something held me back. The feeling of being watched was too intense. I couldn't see anyone. I couldn't hear anything but the distant wind. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. It could be a fellow hiker, someone else who had taken the trail and was just as quiet as I was. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt that wasn't the case. Whoever or whatever was out there didn't seem human. The footsteps, the silence between them, it felt deliberate. I stood still for a long moment, my eyes scanning the woods around me. Nothing. No movement, no sounds. Just the wind. My mind began racing, thinking about the things I had read about hikers getting lost or worse, encountering dangerous people or animals. But I couldn't stand still forever. I forced myself to take a few more steps, quickening my pace as I moved away from the clearing and deeper into the woods. The feeling of being followed didn't subside. Every now and then, I'd hear another sound, just out of reach, branches shifting, leaves rustling, as if something was keeping pace with me. A knot formed in my stomach. It wasn't right. I wasn't just being paranoid. Something was wrong. I tried to push the thoughts out of my head, telling myself to stay calm, to trust my instincts. But the forest felt different now. The trees felt like they were leaning closer, the shadows darker, and I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched, studied even. At some point, I stopped walking. My head was spinning, my breathing shallow. I was lost, there was no doubt about it. The trail had disappeared, replaced by thick underbrush and rocky outcroppings that seemed unfamiliar. I pulled out my map, my hands trembling. It wasn't helping. The paths weren't matching up. Nothing looked right. I scanned the area around me again, the unease swelling into full-blown anxiety now. Was it possible to be lost in a place like this? I thought about turning back, retracing my steps, but the thought of going back to where I'd felt that presence made me freeze. I took another deep breath, trying to clear my head. That's when I saw it. A small, faint trail leading off to the left. It wasn't much, but it was something. I decided to follow it, hoping it would lead me somewhere familiar, somewhere safe. The trail was narrow, barely noticeable, and the dense trees on either side seemed to close in even more. But the further I went, the clearer it became that this wasn't a usual path. It had the appearance of something old, abandoned, and used only by those who knew this land far better than I did. My feet slipped on the wet ground as I navigated the trail, but I didn't dare stop. Something about this place, this narrow, hidden path, made me feel like I was trespassing. Just when I thought it couldn't get worse, I noticed something in the distance. Movement. At first, I thought it was just another trick of the light or the wind playing with the trees. But then it was unmistakable, a figure. Not a person, but something large shifting between the trunks. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The air thickened, and I couldn't breathe for a moment. Was it an animal? A bear? But no, the shape was all wrong for that. I took another step back, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. My body felt like it had betrayed me, frozen in place. Then, as if the world itself had paused, the figure stepped into the open for just a moment. It was gone in an instant. I didn't wait another second. Panic flooded me, and I turned on my heel, running without looking back. I crashed through the trees, dodging branches and rocks. I couldn't remember the last time I had been this terrified. Every snap of a twig underfoot made me flinch, convinced that whatever had been watching me was right behind me, chasing me. I ran until my legs burned, until I couldn't breathe anymore. And then, just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I burst out of the woods. The sunlight hit me like a wave, and I gasped for air, standing in a small meadow that opened up to a clear, wide trail. I kept walking, my heart slowly returning to something resembling normal. I didn't look back, and I didn't stop until I was safely back at the trailhead. I didn't know what I saw that day, but I knew I wasn't going back to that part of the woods. I would never come back to that trail again. I told myself I'd gotten lost, that it was a figment of my overactive imagination, but deep down, I knew better. Something had been out there, and it wasn't human. I never thought hiking would turn out the way it did. I've always been the kind of person who enjoys the simplicity of nature. Just me, the trail, and the open air. But this one hike, this one decision to wander a bit farther into the woods, became something entirely different. It felt like nature itself had decided to trap me, like it wanted me to prove that I truly belonged out there or that I didn't. I don't know if I'll ever be the same after that day. Started off as any regular Saturday morning. I woke up early, grabbed my gear, water, snacks, a first aid kit, and my map, and I headed out to the trails. I had done this hundreds of times before. The mountains were only a short drive from where I lived, so they felt like an easy escape from the noise of the city. The moment I left the pavement behind and entered the trailhead, I was reminded of why I loved being out there. It's hard to explain, but there's something calming about the trees, the earth beneath your boots, the air that's just different, crisper somehow. The path was well marked, familiar to me after all the trips I had taken. It was a typical day, cloudy but warm enough to be comfortable. I started on the lower section of the trail, passing other hikers here and there. It was quiet but not too quiet. Birds chirped in the trees above, and the sound of a distant creek echoed faintly through the woods. I felt relaxed, almost too relaxed, thinking I had everything figured out. I was only planning on taking a short hike that day, a few hours, maybe. Nothing strenuous. A couple of miles to clear my head and be back before dark. But when I reached a fork in the path, I made a decision I now regret. There was a sign that pointed to a trail I had never taken before. The map didn't show much, just a squiggly line going into more rugged terrain. I could have just stayed on the main trail, but something, maybe curiosity or just a desire for a bit of solitude, pushed me to take it. It'll be fine, I told myself. A bit of adventure never hurt anyone. The deeper I went, the more the trail seemed to narrow. The trees began to thicken, the light dimming as the canopy above closed in. It wasn't so much that it was dark. It was more that the shadows were more intense here. The ground became uneven, rocks jutting out from the earth, and the sounds of birds and the creek faded. I found myself alone in a way that felt different than the usual solitude I sought in the wilderness. It wasn't peaceful. It was unsettling. After another hour or so, I started to realize that I hadn't seen another person in a while. It wasn't like the main trail where you'd pass by others every few minutes. Out here, it was dead silent. The air felt heavier, as if the forest was holding its breath. I glanced at my map, but saw no signs that I was off course. Still, something wasn't right. There were no clear markers anymore. No signs or blazes on the trees telling me I was still on track. My stomach churned with unease, but I pushed the feeling down. Just keep going, I thought. You're fine. I wish I had listened to my gut. It was around noon when I came across a spot that seemed out of place. There was a small clearing in the woods, not much larger than a few paces across, with what looked like an old, dilapidated campsite. It wasn't an official site or anything. It looked like it had been abandoned long ago. There was a rusted metal fire ring, the remnants of a fire pit half buried in ash, and the charred remains of a log. Nothing seemed recent, but still, the sight of it stopped me in my tracks. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I decided to take a break, sit on a rock nearby, and eat a snack. I tried not to look too much at the campsite, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling it gave me. It felt wrong, like it had been touched by something or someone I couldn't see. I told myself it was nothing, just an old spot where hikers had camped out before, but the quiet was unsettling. The sounds of the woods had disappeared, leaving only a tense stillness. After a few minutes, I stood up to leave, but something caught my eye. A trail of disturbed earth, faint but noticeable. I bent down to take a closer look. The ground had been scratched up, the soil dug out in small, almost purposeful lines. It wasn't an animal's work. It looked too deliberate for that. And as I stood there, staring at the odd marks, the silence around me seemed to stretch. It was like the woods were holding their breath, waiting for me to move. I took a step back, my heart racing for no good reason. I could feel my instincts kicking in. Something was off. I quickly checked my map again, trying to find a way to make sense of it all. That's when I realized I had no idea where I was. The path that had once seemed familiar was now completely foreign to me. I had wandered off the trail, far enough that I couldn't remember how to get back to the main route. I tried to calm myself down. I wasn't lost, not really, but the thought of having no clear way back to the main trail made me anxious. The forest didn't feel the same anymore. It wasn't a peaceful refuge. It had become something else, something dangerous. My breath quickened, and I forced myself to stay calm. I retraced my steps for what felt like an hour, hoping to find a familiar landmark, but nothing looked the same. No trail signs, no recognizable rock formations, just the endless trees and dense undergrowth. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. It was late afternoon by the time I realized I wasn't going to find my way out on my own. I wasn't even sure which direction I needed to go. The sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows through the trees. Panic started creeping in, and with it, the realization that it was going to be dark soon. I didn't have a flashlight, and my phone, as usual, had no signal. I had to make a decision. I could keep trying to find the main trail, or I could camp out for the night and wait for morning. I wasn't keen on the idea of spending the night out there, especially with how eerie everything felt, but staying put seemed like the safest option. I found a spot near a large boulder and set up my gear. I didn't have much. A small tarp to shield me from the wind, a jacket for warmth, and some snacks to keep me going. The air was growing colder, and the sounds of the woods began to shift again. The birds had quieted down, and now there was an odd buzzing sound, like the forest was alive in a way I didn't understand. I wrapped myself in my jacket and huddled under the tarp, but I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing, my ears straining for any sound, any sign of what was out there with me. I kept telling myself it was just the wilderness, just nature, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was there, something I couldn't see but could feel pressing in on me. The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an hour. Eventually, I must have drifted into a restless sleep, only to be woken by the sound of something moving near my camp. A twig snapped. I froze, listening, heart pounding. Was it a deer? A bear? The hairs on my neck stood up. I held my breath, straining to hear any more sounds. Then, suddenly, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Not animal, but human. The fear that gripped me in that moment was unlike anything I had ever felt. I didn't know who, if anyone, was out there, but I had to move. I grabbed my backpack, trying not to make any noise. I carefully unwrapped the tarp, as quietly as I could. The footsteps weren't far now, just behind the trees, maybe 30 feet away. I didn't know what to do, but staying still seemed like the worst idea. My heart pounded as I crept toward the edge of the clearing, my mind racing. And then, just as quickly as the footsteps started, they stopped. Everything went silent again. I don't know how long I stood there, listening to the silence, but eventually, I gathered enough courage to make a run for it. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know where I was headed, but I ran. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, until my legs felt like they would give out. And then, finally, I stumbled onto a trail. A real trail. Couldn't believe it. I didn't care where it went as long as it led out. I followed it for what felt like hours, exhaustion weighing me down, until I finally saw the faint glow of headlights in the distance. I had made it out. I had escaped. When I reached the parking lot, I collapsed into my car and locked the doors. I sat there for a long time, shaking, trying to make sense of what had happened. There was no clear explanation for any of it, no rational reason for the fear, the unease, the feeling of being watched. But as I drove away from those woods, I knew one thing for sure. I would never set foot on that trail again. And as I looked back at the dark forest in my rearview mirror, I couldn't help but wonder what or who had been following me. I've always enjoyed hiking. It's a way to clear my mind, stretch my legs, and take in the beauty of the world. But that day, that hike was different. Started out like any other. I packed my bag early in the morning, loaded it with water, snacks, and my trusty map. The weather forecast was perfect, sunny with just the right amount of breeze. The trail I was following was well known to locals, though I had never hiked it before. I'd heard people talk about it in town, how it was a peaceful route through the woods with breathtaking views of the valley. I wanted to experience it for myself. The first part of the trail was easy. The ground was firm under my boots, and the path was wide enough for several people to walk side by side. Tall trees lined the edges, their branches stretching high above me, their leaves rustling gently in the wind. Birds chirped somewhere far in the distance, and the occasional rustle of small creatures in the underbrush added to the natural soundtrack. I made my way through the forest, passing over streams and around rocks, enjoying the peace and quiet. My mind wandered as I walked, thinking about everything and nothing at the same time. The trail began to narrow as I went deeper into the woods, and the sounds of civilization slowly faded away. I was starting to feel more isolated, but in a good way. It was a sense of solitude that felt comfortable. At one point, I came across a fork in the trail. I wasn't sure which way to go, but the map in my bag showed the main route veering left, so I took that path. It was a bit steeper here, and the trees grew denser, blocking out more sunlight. The air was cooler, and the atmosphere felt heavier, as if the forest was closing in around me. Still, it was nothing I hadn't dealt with before. I pressed on. As I ascended, the path grew less defined. The trail markers were farther apart, and the ground beneath me became uneven, with roots sticking up from the earth like fingers reaching out to trip me. I stepped carefully, avoiding the worst of them. The sounds of the forest were more pronounced now. Leaves crunching underfoot, distant calls of birds, the occasional thud of something moving in the bushes. But there was something else too, a faint, almost imperceptible hum, like the sound of wind through wires. It was a strange noise that I couldn't quite place. At first, I thought it was just the wind picking up, but it lingered. It wasn't a natural sound, not like anything I had heard on my previous hikes. I stopped for a moment to listen more closely, scanning the trees around me. There was nothing in sight, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something was off. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I had been hiking for a few hours now, and I was starting to feel the fatigue set in. A rest wouldn't hurt. I found a large rock off to the side of the trail, sat down, and took a drink of water. My heart was still pounding from the climb, and I was trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up on me. The hum was still there, faint but persistent. It made my skin crawl, like the feeling you get when you're being watched. But every time I turned around, I saw nothing but the endless stretch of trees and underbrush. I wasn't sure if I should keep going or turn back, but I had come this far and I didn't want to give up. I checked my map again. The trail should have leveled out soon, leading to a lookout point. I'd been looking forward to that. So, after a few more moments of hesitation, I stood up, dusted off my pants, and kept moving. The trail became steeper as I moved further up the mountain, and the air grew colder. The trees thinned out, and the ground was covered in loose rocks. I had to be more careful with every step now. My boots slid a little on the uneven surface, and I had to focus harder than usual to keep my balance. As I moved upward, the hum grew louder, more distinct, almost like a vibration in the air. Felt wrong. I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone, that something was there with me, hidden just out of sight. I pressed on, determined to reach the lookout. I tried to push the nagging feeling out of my mind, but it stuck with me like a shadow. The wind picked up, and the trees creaked ominously above me, their branches swaying and groaning. I was almost at the top now, and I could see the rocky outcrop that marked the lookout point in the distance. But as I approached, something caught my eye, a flash of movement in the corner of my vision. I froze. My heart skipped a beat as I scanned the area, but there was nothing there. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Probably just a squirrel or something, I told myself. I wasn't about to let my imagination get the best of me. I reached the lookout point finally. The view was breathtaking. The valley below stretched out endlessly, with the sunlight glinting off a river winding through the landscape. It was the kind of scene that made you feel small, insignificant even in the grand scheme of things. But it was also peaceful, beautiful. I stood there for a while, just taking it all in, letting the view calm my nerves. But as I stood there, the strange humming sound returned. Now it was unmistakable. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't any natural sound. It felt mechanical, like the sound of distant machinery. I turned around quickly, scanning the trees below, but there was still nothing. I began to feel uncomfortable, my body tense, as if something was watching me from the shadows. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up again, that same feeling of being observed. I wasn't sure what to do. Part of me wanted to stay and enjoy the view, but the other part of me just wanted to get the hell out of there. I decided to start heading back down. The sooner I got off the mountain, the better. My footsteps echoed against the rocks as I turned and made my way back down the trail. I kept my eyes trained on the ground in front of me, not wanting to look up and see anything moving in the trees. I kept hearing that humming, growing louder as I descended, and the sound was making me feel more and more anxious. The wind kicked up, and the trees swayed violently, their branches scraping against each other. The trail was starting to look more unfamiliar, more like the kind of place you wouldn't want to be alone in, especially when the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains. Quickened my pace. That's when I heard it, footsteps. Not animal footsteps, but human footsteps. They were faint at first, but then they grew louder, closer. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, but once again, there was no one there, just the same empty woods. The footsteps stopped as suddenly as they had started, leaving only the rustling of the trees behind. I didn't know what to do. Should I keep walking? Or should I stop and try to listen more carefully? My instincts screamed at me to move faster, but my legs were getting tired. The fatigue was setting in, but the fear gave me the adrenaline to keep going. The humming sound had become deafening now, and I felt like it was all around me. The atmosphere had shifted. Everything seemed colder, darker. I didn't recognize the trail I was on anymore. The trees were thicker, the shadows darker, and the path had turned into a near impossible scramble over rocks and roots. I stumbled on a rock and fell hard on my knees. The sharp pain shot through my body, but I didn't have time to react. I pushed myself back up and forced my legs to keep moving, my mind racing, heart pounding. That's when I saw it. A faint flicker of movement ahead of me, a figure just out of sight, darting between the trees. Panic surged through me. I wasn't sure if I had seen it clearly or if it was a trick of my mind, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I ran, my feet slipping on the rocky path, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get off the mountain. The sun had almost set by the time I reached the bottom, the last sliver of light disappearing behind the horizon. My legs burned with exhaustion, but I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the forest. I finally stumbled into the clearing, gasping for air. The woods behind me were silent.
No humming, no footsteps.
Nothing. I stood there for a few minutes, just catching my breath and trying to make sense of what had happened. Maybe I had just let my imagination get the best of me, I thought. Maybe I was just tired, and the strange noise was some odd echo or wind. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something I couldn't explain. I wasn't sure if I would ever return to that trail again, but as I walked back toward the parking lot, I felt a strange sense of relief. The woods behind me were quiet now, but I couldn't forget what I had felt. As I reached the car, I glanced back one last time. The woods loomed in the distance, dark and silent, but I felt no urge to go back. Maybe it was just the wild, untamed nature of the forest. Or maybe there was something else, something I'd never understand. Either way, I was glad to be out of there. I started the car and drove home, the sound of the engine a comforting hum in the otherwise quiet night. And though I couldn't explain everything that had happened, I knew one thing for sure. Sometimes it's better not to question too much. It was supposed to be a simple hike, nothing extraordinary. Just me, my boots, and the winding trails of a secluded forest. I had been to this area before many times, and every time I was there, it felt like home. I'd always been drawn to the outdoors. The quiet of nature, the rustle of leaves, the sound of distant birds. It was peaceful, and I enjoyed the solitude. The trail I had picked for today wasn't too difficult, nor too long. A few hours of hiking, maybe a bit more, and I'd be back to my car before the sun set. At least that was the plan. The morning was crisp, the air fresh, and everything seemed perfect. The forest was alive with the sound of birds, but it wasn't overwhelming, just a gentle chorus in the background. I took my first few steps on the trail, the earth beneath my boots soft from the overnight rain. The ground squished beneath each step, but not enough to make me worry about slipping. For the first hour, everything felt like any other hike I had taken. The path was easy to follow, the trees towering overhead, casting long, shaded shadows across the trail. I wasn't entirely alone. There were a few other hikers here and there, but none that I saw for long. I didn't mind the solitude. In fact, I preferred it. There was something calming about being alone in the woods. No one around to talk to, no one to distract you from your thoughts. Just the crunch of leaves underfoot and the steady rhythm of my breath. I remember the first sign that something wasn't quite right. It was subtle, nothing huge, just the sudden quiet. The birds, which had been so loud earlier, stopped their songs. The wind stopped rustling the leaves in the trees. The entire forest seemed to pause for a moment, as though holding its breath. It wasn't the kind of silence you could easily ignore either. It wasn't peaceful. It was unnerving. I shook it off at first, probably just a shift in the weather or an animal moving nearby. I continued on, trying to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. But the longer I walked, the more the atmosphere seemed to shift. The air felt heavier, thicker, and the shadows under the trees grew darker, longer. I noticed that the trail wasn't as well defined as it had been earlier. It wasn't anything major, just little changes in the path. Twists and turns that weren't there before, a fork in the trail where none had been before. At one point, I stopped and pulled out my map, convinced I had somehow veered off the main trail. But the map didn't make sense. The markings didn't match up with the path I was on, and when I looked around, the forest seemed unfamiliar. The trees weren't the same, the underbrush more dense. A knot formed in my stomach. I didn't like this. I didn't like it at all. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I just needed to backtrack a little, retrace my steps, and I'd find the right path again. So, I turned around and began walking back, but the deeper I went into the woods, the more it felt like the trail was slipping away from me. The trees closed in tighter, their branches stretching across the path, blocking my way. At one point, I saw a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye, just a flicker. I froze, heart pounding. I wasn't alone. My mind raced. There had to be other hikers around. Maybe someone else was nearby. I turned to look, but there was nothing. Just trees, shadows, and the same endless trail winding through the forest. The sound of my own breath was suddenly too loud, too harsh. I kept walking, quicker now, almost rushing. Every few minutes, I stopped to look around, trying to spot a familiar landmark. But the woods were disorienting. The more I tried to find something I recognized, the less certain I was about where I was. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, and the deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. There was no one, just me, the trees, and the crushing weight of silence. And then I heard it, a faint sound, a soft crunch of leaves behind me. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but it was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Someone was following me. I spun around, expecting to see another hiker, someone who had been walking behind me without me noticing. But the forest was empty. No one. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something was wrong. My pulse quickened, my mind racing for an explanation. Maybe it was just the wind, I told myself. Maybe the forest was playing tricks on me. But no matter how hard I tried to reason with myself, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The air had grown colder. The once soft trail was now rocky and uneven, the ground littered with roots and fallen branches. I stumbled a few times, my boots catching on the jagged rocks, my breathing quick and shallow. The path seemed to go on forever, each step feeling heavier than the last. I couldn't remember the last time I had seen any other hikers. The forest was becoming oppressive, the trees closing in around me like they were trying to trap me inside. Just as panic started to settle in, I came to a clearing, a small one. There, in the middle of the clearing, was a tiny creek, no bigger than a stream, really. The water flowed gently, sparkling in the sunlight that managed to break through the canopy above. For a moment, I felt a sense of relief. I could hear the water flowing, the peaceful sound cutting through the tension that had built up in the air. I walked over to the creek, kneeling down to splash my face with the cold water. It was refreshing, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I allowed myself to breathe deeply. I had been walking too fast, too panicked. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I had imagined everything. I looked around the clearing again. Everything seemed peaceful here, calm. But then, I noticed something strange. The water in the creek was moving in an odd way. It wasn't flowing naturally. It was swirling, almost like something was beneath the surface, disturbing the flow. I leaned closer, trying to see what was causing the disturbance. But the moment I did, I heard it again, that crunching sound. Closer this time. I stood up quickly, heart racing. I spun around, scanning the edges of the clearing. My stomach dropped when I saw it. Just at the edge of the trees, a figure was standing, watching me. It wasn't clear at first, just a silhouette, standing motionless in the shadows. But I could feel its eyes on me. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of a person standing completely still. My mind screamed at me to run, to get away, but my legs refused to move. I was frozen in place, staring at the figure, waiting for it to make a move. Didn't. It just stood there as still as the trees around it. And then it turned, slowly, its head pivoting with unnerving slowness, until it was facing the other direction, as though it had no interest in me at all. I didn't wait. I didn't even think about it. I just ran. My heart was pounding in my chest as I sprinted back through the woods, blindly, desperately. I didn't know where I was going anymore, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away from that clearing, away from that figure. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, though it could have been minutes. But eventually, I found myself back on a familiar trail, the same one I had started on earlier in the day. The trees were less dense here, the path wider. The sky was starting to darken, the sun setting behind the horizon. I kept moving, my legs burning with exhaustion. The trail was almost empty now. No more hikers, no more sounds of the forest. Just the rhythm of my breathing, my boots on the ground, and the growing darkness. When I reached my car, I didn't stop to think. I didn't even check if anyone was following me. I just jumped in, slammed the door, and drove. As I pulled away from the parking lot, I glanced into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the woods, watching me leave. There was nothing, just the empty forest. But I knew what I had seen. I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to. When I got home, I locked the door, drew the blinds, and tried to forget about the woods. Tried to pretend that what I had felt wasn't real. But I knew deep down that it was. And I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to that forest. Ever. It was supposed to be just another routine hiking trip. I had done the same route dozens of times before, so it should have felt familiar, comfortable even. But this time, something felt different. Maybe it was the weather or the quiet, almost unsettling stillness in the air. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off as I made my way up the trail. The path was the same one I'd taken countless times, a moderate climb that led up to a scenic overlook. It was an easy, almost peaceful hike, with tall trees on either side that filtered the sunlight in a way that made everything look like a painting. Birds were chirping, the rustle of leaves sounded soothing, and for a moment, I even considered how lucky I was to be out here, away from the noise of the city. But then, as I made my way past a particularly dense cluster of trees, I noticed something. A faint sound, almost like a low growl, echoed through the woods. I stopped in my tracks, trying to dismiss it as nothing more than the wind or maybe an animal. The woods were full of wildlife, after all, but the sound lingered, a dull, unsettling hum that seemed to vibrate in the pit of my stomach. I stood there for a moment, trying to figure out what it could be. A deer? A bear? But no, it wasn't a normal animal sound. It was deeper, almost mechanical, like a rumble coming from somewhere just below the surface of the earth. My heart started to race, but I told myself it was just my nerves. I hadn't encountered anything like this before, and I'd spent enough time out in nature to know that sometimes your mind can play tricks on you when you're alone in the woods. I took a deep breath and continued up the path, my boots crunching against the dry leaves beneath my feet. The noise faded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I tried to tell myself it was just the quiet of the forest amplifying every sound, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a sense of unease settle deep within me. The trail split up ahead, with a sign pointing toward a detour that led down to a small stream. I had been on this route before, but I'd never taken the detour. Something about the idea of wandering off the main trail didn't sit well with me, but for some reason, today I felt the pull to explore. Maybe I was just trying to shake off the strange feeling that had crept in, or maybe I thought the stream would offer some sort of distraction. I took the turn and descended into a more overgrown section of the forest. The trees here were thicker, and the air seemed heavier, as if the canopy above blocked out more sunlight. The usual chirping of birds was replaced by a thick, suffocating silence. The further I went, the more isolated I felt. The trail grew less defined, and I had to push branches out of the way to continue. About 20 minutes into the detour, I came across a large rock outcropping beside the stream. The sound of running water was calming, and I paused to rest, sitting on the warm stone. I hadn't realized how tired I was until I finally stopped moving. I took a deep breath, closing my eyes for a moment and letting the cool breeze brush against my face. When I opened them again, I noticed something strange. A set of footprints near the water's edge. They didn't look like animal prints, and they certainly didn't belong to anyone I knew. They were large, heavy prints, almost as if someone had been walking barefoot through the stream. But the thing that made them unsettling was how recent they looked. Still fresh, the edges of the prints sharp, the earth around them still damp. I leaned forward, inspecting them more closely. My mind started racing. Could someone else be out here? It was rare to see anyone on this trail, especially down here by the stream. I was a good hour or more from the main trail, and I hadn't passed anyone on my way in. As I stood up to get a better look at the prints, I heard it again, the growl. This time it was unmistakable. It came from deeper within the woods, much closer than before. My heart skipped a beat. I had no idea what it was, but the sound sent a rush of adrenaline through me. I was alone out here. The thought of someone or something being so close, so hidden, felt wrong. My first instinct was to turn back, but then I remembered the map back at the trailhead. There was a small lookout point not far from where I was, and if I could make it there, I would be able to see the surrounding area and maybe figure out what was going on. I didn't want to risk going deeper into the forest, but I also didn't want to stay in this eerie spot any longer. I decided to head back toward the main trail, making my way carefully along the stream. The footprints seemed to follow the path, and with every step I took, the growl grew louder. It felt like it was echoing all around me now, as if the trees themselves were vibrating with the sound. I quickened my pace, my breathing shallow, trying not to panic. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, the woods behind me were still and silent. But that feeling, that sense of being watched, only grew stronger. The weight in the air felt heavier, like I was being pulled into something I couldn't see or understand. Then I heard it, a snap of a twig. It was clear, loud, and unmistakable. Someone or something was following me. I didn't wait around to confirm it. I broke into a full sprint, the rough terrain and thick underbrush making every step more difficult. My legs burned as I pushed myself harder, dodging branches and leaping over rocks. I couldn't hear the growl anymore, but I could hear the footsteps, slightly slower, but still gaining on me. Whoever or whatever was back there wasn't in any rush, but they were getting closer and I could feel it. I finally burst out of the trees and back onto the main trail, my heart pounding in my chest. The familiar sight of the open path gave me a momentary sense of relief, but I didn't stop running. I kept my pace, moving as quickly as I could. I didn't know what was behind me, but I wasn't about to find out. It felt like an eternity before I reached the overlook. When I finally did, I skidded to a halt, gasping for air, my eyes scanning the landscape. The valley below me stretched out in all directions, a sea of green interrupted only by jagged rocks and scattered boulders. But there was no sign of movement, no sign of anyone else. I collapsed onto a nearby rock, my muscles sore and my mind racing. I looked around one more time, still searching for something, anything that could explain what had just happened. The trail was still empty. The forest was still quiet. There was no growl, no footsteps, no presence following me. For a long time, I stayed there, staring out at the view. It was beautiful, peaceful, and in that moment, I realized something. The feeling I'd had earlier, the one that had made me uneasy, wasn't just my imagination. It had been a warning, a reminder that nature isn't always as peaceful as it seems. That silence in the woods had been the calm before something else took over. I took a deep breath and decided it was time to go back. I couldn't explain what had happened, and I didn't know who or what had been following me. But I knew one thing: I wasn't going back down that detour again. I made my way back down the main trail, retracing my steps, never once looking back. By the time I made it to the parking lot, the sun was beginning to set, casting a soft golden light over the trees. My car was the only one left in the lot, and I didn't feel an ounce of hesitation as I unlocked the door and slid inside. I glanced around one last time, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing. As I drove away from the trailhead, I tried to make sense of what had happened, but in the end, I couldn't. It wasn't the kind of thing you could explain easily. It was just one of those moments where the woods felt alive in a way that was both breathtaking and terrifying. And as I pulled onto the main road, I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't be going back into those woods anytime soon. I set out for the hike with nothing more than a vague sense of adventure and a little impatience to get away from the usual noise of the city. The trail I chose was known for its beauty but was mostly avoided by other hikers because it was a bit more rugged and difficult. To be honest, I liked it that way. I'd rather be alone on the path than dealing with crowds or people who didn't take the wilderness seriously. The weather was perfect for a long hike, sunny but cool, with just enough breeze to keep it comfortable. I arrived at the trailhead around 9 a.m., pulling my boots on and adjusting my backpack. I made sure I had plenty of water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a map. My phone had service here, but I wasn't counting on it. I had studied the trail map at home, so I felt pretty confident. I started off, my footsteps muffled by the dry leaves beneath me. The first part of the trail was easy, just a gentle slope through tall pines. I could hear the faint rustling of small animals in the underbrush, birds chirping overhead. The air smelled like pine and fresh earth, which always calmed me down. For the first couple of miles, everything felt perfectly normal. Nothing seemed out of place. It wasn't until I reached the fork in the trail that something felt off. I had two options: continue down the main path or take a side trail that looped deeper into the woods. According to the map, the loop was supposed to add a few more miles but promised some stunning views at the top. I decided to take it. I wanted the extra challenge and the reward of a great view. As soon as I stepped off the main trail, the atmosphere changed. The trees seemed denser here, their branches intertwining in a thick canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. The trail was narrower, overgrown in some parts, and I found myself brushing aside ferns and low-hanging branches as I pushed forward. I hadn't seen another person in hours, and for some reason, the stillness of the forest began to weigh on me. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My pace quickened without me even thinking about it. The trail twisted, narrowed, and began to climb at a steeper incline. My breath grew heavier with each step, but the feeling of being observed didn't fade. It almost felt like the trees were closing in around me. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath and took a look around. The forest seemed eerily quiet now. No chirping birds, no rustling of animals. Just silence. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I shook my head. It was nothing. It was just my mind. Maybe I was overthinking it. I kept going, but the strange sensation didn't let up. Every now and then, I would hear a twig snap behind me or the faintest sound of something moving through the brush. Each time I would turn around, but there was never anything there. By now, I was deep into the trail. The map had said it was a short loop, but I hadn't seen any signposts for a while. I checked my watch, 11:30 a.m. I'd been hiking for a couple of hours, but something about this stretch of woods was starting to get to me. I reached a clearing, and for a moment, I thought I saw something in the distance. A figure standing in the shadow of the trees, too still to be a person. But when I blinked, it was gone. Could have been my eyes playing tricks, but it left a cold knot in my stomach. I pulled out my phone to check my location, but the signal was spotty. I looked at the map, but the trail markers weren't matching up with what I was seeing around me. The paths on the map were clear, but here, everything seemed to blend together, twisting paths that seemed familiar yet unfamiliar. The more I looked at the map, the more confused I became. I tried to shake off the unease, but it was hard. I decided to turn back, retracing my steps, but as I moved deeper into the woods, everything started to feel different. The trees loomed taller, darker. The path, which had been clear before, now seemed to fade, replaced by tangled roots and rocks that made it harder to move forward. I looked at my watch again. 12:30 p.m. An hour had passed since I'd last checked. How had I lost so much time? I'd been going in circles. I stopped to listen, hoping to hear the distant sound of a stream or another hiker. But all I could hear was my own breathing, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I noticed it. At first, it was just a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. Then I saw it clearly, a person, a man, standing off to the side, not far from the trail. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, staring at me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't normal. There was no one else supposed to be out here. And yet, there he was, just standing, not responding when I called out. I took a step backward, but before I could turn and run, the man turned and disappeared into the trees, vanishing into the thick underbrush. For a moment, I considered following him, thinking he might be lost too, but something in my gut told me not to. I couldn't explain why, but I knew that was a mistake. I started moving again, faster this time. My mind raced. What had I seen? Was it just someone else hiking the trail? Maybe I was overreacting, but the way he had disappeared so quickly, it didn't sit right with me. I pushed myself harder, every step a struggle as the trail grew steeper. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger now. My legs were getting tired, my throat dry. I didn't know how much longer I could keep going. Then I spotted it, a sign. It was small and worn, barely visible in the thick brush, but it was there, pointed to the main trail. Couldn't believe it. I was so close to being back. With renewed energy, I followed the sign, and soon enough, I emerged from the woods and saw the main trail ahead. I let out a breath I didn't even know I was holding. I was back. The rest of the hike was calm, even though I was shaken. When I made it back to the parking lot, I didn't see anyone else around. No other hikers. It was almost as if I had been alone on that trail the whole time. The feeling of unease didn't leave me, though. I kept thinking about that man. Had he been real, or was it just the isolation of the forest playing tricks on me? As I drove home, the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the road. I had made it out, but something inside me felt different. The forest had changed me in a way I couldn't explain, and though I had come out safely, I couldn't shake the sense that it wasn't just a random hike. I would return to that trail one day, but next time I would be more prepared. I wasn't going to let fear rule me. I had made it out alive, and that was the only thing that mattered.